inner journey, one can be attracted and seeking this bliss, because when you come down with this, one experiences this bit of the light and power of the divine, and one comes down, absolute divine, there is Ananda, and one says that it has been hard work transcending these two lures, purifying myself from so many different levels of illusion. Now I don't want to go back. The bliss soul is not bound to birth or to non-birth. It is not driven by the desire of the knowledge or harassed by the fear of the ignorance. कि मैं वापस यहाँ पे आऊँगा, वापस ignorance होगा. It is not harassed by that fear of ignorance. This talk is a part of a series on Sri Aurobindo's book, Synthesis of Yoga. And the name of the chapter which we are going to explore today is Gnosis and Ananda. Ananda, or bliss, or eternal bliss and eternal joy, is a seeking which is common to all of us. There would be no person who would not want to be in a blissful state, a state of eternal joy. So it is one seeking which is common to all of us, but how to be in Ananda and how to act in Ananda. What are the various levels of Ananda? Because Ananda can have different meanings for different people. So what are the various levels of Ananda? And how does it relate to Gnosis, or supramental consciousness, a consciousness beyond mind, is what is the exploration of this chapter. If we have to start from where Ananda is more tangible to us, one can experience it in a little infant. The joy and the sparkle in the eyes of an infant. The mind is not yet fully developed in a child, and the child operates out of that inner being. So that innocent light radiating from an infant is something very close to Ananda. And it is very similar to what we might see as a sparkle in the eye of a true yogi. Or when we do something for others, when there is no personal gain, when the mind is not counting that what is in it for me, the kind of joy that we experience is again close to Ananda. Or when we wake up fresh, there again there is a little sparkle in us. Or if we feel close to that form of divine or that personality of the divine which we adore, at that time again we experience that Ananda and radiate it. Or for those of us who meditate and seek to experience the divine in its absolute, transcendent, formless version, and when one merges into it, there is a certain ecstasy in that. That is another aspect of Ananda. So Ananda has different meanings, different experiences, different intensities, different level of purities. But all the same, it is Ananda. And this chapter, Gnosis and Ananda, which is part of the section on yoga of integral knowledge. So the section of the book Synthesis of Yoga deals with Jnana Yoga, an integral Jnana Yoga, and the seeking in the previous few chapters has been about the supramental plane. So this chapter is about how does the supramental and Ananda relate to it. It is something which one can look at from any philosophy, or varied different sages, saints, Sri Aurobindo have talked about that the planes of consciousness, although they are infinite, but broadly can be classified into 7 planes, the topmost being Sat, the second plane being Chit, third being Ananda, the fourth being supramental or Gnosis, which we were referring to, fifth being mind, then sixth vital or prana, and then seventh being physical. So this chapter is about also the relation. One is the exploration of what is Ananda, but how does the fourth and the fifth plane, the Gnosis or the supramental plane and the Ananda plane, they relate to each other. Usually the human potential, as best as it understood, is at the level of the lower 5 planes, or the Ananda and the supramental, mind, vital, and the body. And out of even these 5 planes, Gnosis and Ananda plane is more of a future possibility of human beings. In the current context, most of us operate out of the lower 3 planes, which is the mind, life, and the body. And amongst these 3 planes also, most of the time, the life is panning out at the first plane, which is physical. Because even in the physical, there is a body mind and there is a body vital. So when we are living a life where our identity is that I am this body, then the brain or the mind is felt to be housed inside this body, and the energy or prana also is housed in this body, and it brings that limitation. So for most of us in our day-to-day life, the life actually is panning out at the first level, which is the physical. But we all definitely in the present moment have that inherent capacity to withdraw into the vital or the energetic sphere, where we don't feel like just this body, withdraw into the sphere of mind. So that is a very tangible and real possibility for us. And Ananda as a experience happens at each of these levels. It is not exclusive to the 5th layer. Ananda is experienced at physical, vital, mental, Gnosis, supramental, Ananda in every level. But the experience at each level is slightly different. It depends on how we are all differently built, and also depending on the state of consciousness. In a body-bound consciousness, the Ananda experience will be different. If one feels like a ball of energy, then the experience of Ananda will be different. When one feels like this mind, then the experience of Ananda may be different. And at each level, when one opens up to the experience of Ananda, it almost feels like an ultimate experience. The person experiencing communion with the divine form that they adore feels that this is the ultimate experience. Or a sadhak in a meditative state where one has let go of this body identity and is in a meditative state and experiences the ecstasy, that again might seem like an ultimate experience. Or even just looking at that child beaming with joy also can seem like that ultimate experience, that there can be nothing beyond this. But this is where Sri Aurobindo points out through these words. He says that for each of the divine principles contains in itself the whole potentiality of all the other 6 notes of our being. Each plane of nature can have its own perfection of these notes under its own conditions. So each of the layer carries within it all the other 6 layers. So for the physical plane also there are these 7 planes. For the vital level also there are these 7 planes. It is like the microcosm and the macrocosm. Just like this whole universe full of planets and galaxies and satellites. The same way, if you go into the microcosm, if you break down the cell, you go to the molecule, you go to the atom, and you see the similar pattern. You see a nucleus and electrons all around. So same way, at every level, there is a mirroring. So the Ananda plane is existent at the level of the physical plane as well, at the level of vital plane as well. So all 7 layers. And at each plane, they have their own sense of perfection. But the integral perfection can come only by a mounting ascent of the lowest into the highest, and an incessant descent of the highest into the lowest, till all becomes one at once, solid block and plastic sea stuff of the truth infinite eternal. So Sri Aurobindo here says that sure, this is a perfection, and sure, you have had this beautiful, seemingly ultimate experience at whichever plane you are operating out of. But the seeking of integral yoga is integral perfection. And for integral perfection, each of these 6 layers need to ascend into the highest, and then from there has to be an incessant descent. There is an endless pouring from that highest plane into the lowest plane until there is a complete transformation, and he uses the word in transformation into one solid block. So all the layers disappear, it turns into one solid block, and yet also plastic sea stuff. So the body transforms into a mold of the spirit. The vital becomes a channel of the spirit. The mind beams with the light and knowledge of the divine. So that is the integral perfection. Of course, this is an ideal set before us, which may be even beyond our capacities, but it just helps us break that illusion that I have had that ultimate experience of what divine is, I am enlightened now. So it helps us go beyond that and see how infinite is our goal of integral perfection, and it makes us strive at every step. One sees them as little milestones on the journey. We enjoy the journey, but see where the ultimate goal is, integral perfection. So now that we understand that Ananda or bliss or eternal joy can be experienced by anyone and everyone, no matter which plane we are operating out of, the next question is, how does one experience Ananda, especially since most of our life pans out from the physical level? If there is a physical identity, from there, how does the experience of Ananda happen? Now here, before we discuss the how, it's important to make a distinction between 2 commonly confused terms. One is pleasure and bliss. Pleasure is something which is more of a sensory experience. For example, there is an ice cream in front of us and we really enjoy that flavor, and we reach out for that ice cream and we taste it, we eat it. So there is a certain pleasure that we experience in our sensory, and it may touch our heart. It may be associated with so many beautiful memories for us. So we experience a certain joy or happiness. But if we see, this pleasure is seated in the senses, or at best a little bit in the heart, and it needs an outer object and a certain external condition to fulfill just the right taste, just the right sweetness, just the right temperature for it to bring in that experience. Whereas bliss is something unconditional. Bliss is something absolute. One can take the analogy of a light bulb. So whereas for an ice cream one is reaching out, the bliss is like a light bulb which is shining and radiating out. The child who is beaming with joy without anything is like a light bulb. He's just shining, and at times he doesn't need anything. So that is the nature of the bliss, and the distinction between bliss and what we refer to as pleasure. But even pleasure, when we are reaching out for the ice cream and pleasure, the seeking is no different. The seeking is still Ananda. We are all seeking Ananda in everything what we are reaching out for. But usually the Ananda is much deeper. And what we are enjoying is the surface through the senses, which is the pleasure. Another difference or distinction is that pleasure dulls over a period of time. That same ice cream, if it is eaten every day, after some time it doesn't bring that same pleasure, and after some time it almost seems like boring and you don't want to eat that ice cream. Whereas bliss intensifies over a period of time. The more closer, the more sincerely we engage in the practice, the more closer we feel to the divine, the Ananda intensifies. The hunger for Ananda intensifies over a period of time. So this is the distinction between the bliss and the pleasure. And now coming to how does one experience this bliss or Ananda at the level of physical. So it is true not just for physical but vital and the mental at all the three lower planes, that this experience can happen in two ways. One is wherein we expand that aspect of the being, for example the physical, and merge it with a universal identity. One feels like a ball of light or visualizes light in the physical, and that light body expands to its universal or infinite form, and then one can reflect the Ananda into this infinite mold in the physical. Or the other way, so one is an expansion and reflection of the higher. The second is going deep into anything. When we go deep into any part of our body through the feelings, eventually at the level of essence, we can experience Ananda. Maybe it's something we can experience right now so that it becomes tangible to us what is being shared. So maybe we can close our eyes and let's make it an experience for ourselves. We take a few deep breaths and focus on our breath. Visualize a flower in the heart, and we breathe through this flower in the heart and go deeper and deeper into the heart. Visualizing the flower, bringing the attention to any one part of the body, and whichever is that part, which one chooses to hold it with one's hand and touch it and feel it and breathe through it. And feel going deeper and deeper into that part. Being close to the breath, holding the imagination of flower in the heart, and going deeper into that part of the body chosen to feel. And as one goes deeper and deeper, one can experience the tension, the relaxation, the contraction, the knots, the ease, and deeper, the darkness and the light, until one reaches the very center of that part, which naturally comes as a fountain of light, as an experience of Ananda. It may come differently to each one of us at a different pace, but all the same, it eventually comes. And now, regaining the natural consciousness, one can feel the lightness in that part which one had chosen to experience the Ananda in. Again, bringing our attention to the heart and the flower, and breathing through the flower. Now one can take one's attention and visualize light in every part of the body, starting from the toes and the feet and the calf muscle, the thighs, hips, the lower back, the mid back, the upper back, the belly, the chest, the forearms and hands and the arms, the shoulders, neck and the face. Breathing through the flower, seeing oneself as a ball of light, letting this light or the physical expand to this whole ashram, Delhi, India, Earth, solar system, galaxy, and the universe. And breathing through this universe, one doesn't just feel like this physical body becomes into a cell of a large cosmic body. And one experiences this luminosity, this silence of expansion, and with that, the experience of freedom that comes, and the experience of joy and lightness that comes. So coming back, this is something that, again, we can have varied intensities of this experience, but broadly, whichever part we chose to experience this Ananda in, at the very depth of it, that bliss can be experienced through going deep inside us, and it also can be experienced by expansion. But here Sri Aurobindo shares the limitation of this experience of Ananda and freedom. Both the things come with this experience. One feels a subtle joy and a certain level of freeness. But it also brings a certain level of passivity. One feels like a silent, and Sri Aurobindo uses the analogy and uses the word jadavat, like a floating leaf. One becomes like a floating leaf in this universe, and wherever the wind blows, one may blow away in that direction because one is not anchored in a higher center. So one becomes into like a child without responsibilities, or like into a floating leaf. So there is a freedom and joy, but there is no self-mastery, or there is no sublimation or transformation of the nature in this kind of freedom and Ananda experienced at a physical level. The same thing transpires at a vital level, that by withdrawing the consciousness first from the physical to the vital plane, and then either going deep into the essence or expanding, one can experience Ananda. But again, because vital is more intense, it is more effulgent, it has like a volcanic energy to it. The waves in it can be much more intense, and on one side there can be that same passive, joyful experience, but there can also be an experience of what Sri Aurobindo refers to as unmattavat. If in physical it was jadavat, it was like a floating leaf, here it's unmattavat. Unmatta refers to madness. So it brings a divine madness in play, where one becomes unaware of the conventions and sings along in the divine madness. So that kind of an experience can happen, which can be to varying degrees, and again can land up a person into a psychiatrist's clinic. So that is at the level of vital. The Ananda coming at the level of mind or mental plane can be more practicable and more livable, because mind is closer to that higher faculty. So mind can either expand and become silent and passive and mirror not just the Ananda, but also that divine knowledge and the divine light. And if one becomes passive, one can live the life of a hermit, or retreat from the life, minimalistic life, go into a jungle or Himalayas and live a very minimalistic life. Or if one chooses to make the process more dynamic by going to the essence of the mind and exploring the higher layers of mind, there is the illumined mind, there is the intuitive mind, there is the overmind, which is more and more dynamic. So then one can mirror that Ananda and joy that is being experienced in the mind into everyone. And one sees everyone with those blissful eyes, with that joy and Ananda. And in process, that compassion, that saintly compassion can flow through that person. So at the level of Manomaya Kosha, the Ananda has a more dynamic and practical possibility, but still it doesn't bring that full self-mastery or sublimation of the nature. Yet it is more practical, and it is more of what is our current possibility, but it is still not a complete self-mastery. and sublimation of the nature. And that complete mastery and sublimation happens from a higher plane, which Aurobindo describes that the Gnostic soul, or the Vijnanamaya, which is the supramental soul, the Vijnanamaya Purusha is the first to participate not only in the freedom, but in the power and sovereignty of the eternal. So it is at this level that the soul not just is free, but is also in power. It is in charge and has that sovereignty. So it's like the central government and the state government. One may take the analogy of the Gnosis plane being the central government, supramental plane, and the ego seated within all of us as the state government, because it's the each one of us to operate practically in this world. We need a center for regulation around which everything goes, and it's a very basic need. So either we are operating out of the state government, or we can operate out of the central government, or the state government, which is our ego, can be in alignment with the central government, where it obeys the divine will. When that happens, then the life is lived with more peace and ease. But when the state government revolts from that central government, when we assert for our self-will over the divine will, then the life has its own struggles and lack of ease, restlessness, and lack of resources, because the center is not willing to share itself fully with the state government in that case. So either there can be an alignment between the state and central government, there can be a disalignment, or the state government, the people in the state may overthrow the state government. So the ego is overthrown by the physical, vital, and the mental, and they expand into a sort of a non-identity merging with the universe. But when that happens, if the control or the charge is not taken over by the central government, the Gnosis plane is still not regulating the whole process, then it brings that chaos in the state, which is what Sri Aurobindo referred to as Jadavat. The state can become too inert, not do anything, and float around. Or it can turn it to Unmattavat, where it turns into an entire chaos in the whole state. So Gnosis is that first plane from where this higher central regulation is possible. So this is a very important point to understand, because this impulse to freedom is natural to all of us, and there is no point negating this impulse for joy or Ananda, or this impulse to be free. But if it gets channelized in just an expansion without seeking that higher center of regulation, then it can create trouble. I'm reminded of an example. As a doctor, I had a patient, a 21-year-old boy, who, having worked very hard through his schooling days, and he got into a wonderful college in Canada, and now, he's supposed to be that star kid who is successful and doing very well. But now he's looking back at his life and he feels that how much pressure was put on him, and now he wants freedom. So his only narrative is, I want freedom. And in seeking of that freedom, and how the West operates, he has been lured into alcohol, cannabis, weed, things like that, which brings an experience of Ananda. There's a certain joy or a high that the person experiences. So he wants freedom, he wants Ananda, but in process, he may be losing that center of self-regulation. And when that center, and you lose your lower state government or lower center of self-regulation, and that higher one is not developed, this is the kind of chaos one can find oneself in. So it is very important to channelize this impulse to freedom in all of us in the right direction, where one seeks a divine control in our life. When this becomes our seeking, that I seek a divine control in the life, then one's compass aligns towards the Gnosis plane. We may not at this point of time in life arrive at the Gnosis plane. It may not be our possibility in this lifetime. But at least if our seeking is to seek the divine freedom through a divine control, to seek the Ananda through a divine control, then at least our compass is aligned and we are progressing in the right direction. And that journey will go through differently for different people. For some people, they will open up to the psychic being, which is a center of self-regulation in the depths of the heart. Some may open up to a center above their head. It depends on person to person, but one needs to have the seeking clear, which is seeking a divine control over one's life. Another very important thing is that the Gnosis plane does not reject the Jadavat or the Unmattavat. It doesn't say that this is all false, because it is a true experience of freedom and Ananda. But at the level of Gnosis, that luminous passivity of the physical, that experience we just had, is now anchored by the Gnosis, and that same passivity becomes capable of the intensest divine action. Then Unmattavat, or that divine madness, turns into the wise madness, where one breaks the convention only where it is necessary. Shri Krishna, with all the tools, with all the powers, chose to exercise them in Mahabharata only where it was absolutely necessary, broke the conventions only where it was necessary. So it was a wise madness or a wise breaking of the convention. So the Gnosis plane doesn't reject the Ananda of the physical or the vital or the mental, but it anchors the Ananda of each of these planes. And then eventually the vital Ananda, or the effulgence of the vital, when it is anchored by this higher Gnosis plane and it turns it into a rhythm or a dance of life, then it turns into the Rasa Leela of Shri Krishna. And that becomes a beautiful Ananda, an ultimate experience of Ananda. And this is where one may ask that if the ultimate Rasa Leela, which is one of the most beautiful experiences of a dynamic Ananda, is playing out at the level of Gnosis, then what higher can be there than this? If this is the supramental plane, this is the fourth plane, what more higher can be there at the fifth plane, which is the Ananda Maya Kosha? And this Sri Aurobindo explains by sharing that at the lower three levels, Ananda is experienced through dissolution and dilution. So there has to be a dissolution of identity. The identity has to go and expand into oneness with the infinite. And there is a dilution, because at the physical, vital and mental plane, it is limited in many different ways. It distorts the things. So Ananda is experienced with a certain dilution. वो चीनी को घोल दिया गया पानी में तो उतना sweet नहीं है वो. So there is a certain dilution and dissolution. But at the level of Gnosis, there is neither dissolution nor dilution. So there is still an identity. There is a higher identity one adopts. There is a center of regulation. And the Ananda is being experienced in its purest form. So at the level of one plane higher, at the level of Anandamaya Kosha, there is no dilution, but there is again dissolution. And now the identity is again lost into an absolute blissful oneness. At this plane, there is no knowledge, there is no knower, there is no known. It's absolute, it is one. And at this plane, it is not like there is no possibility of the world play. In fact, it is the source of the world play, and yet it exceeds the world play, and it manifests the world play through its expression through the Gnosis, and the manifestation happens. Although we are talking about this plane of Anandmaya Kosha, but it's very important to acknowledge at this point that it is not even a human possibility at this point of time to experience or be at the level of Anandmaya Kosha. But this is how Sri Aurobindo describes it, that at this plane, there is again a dissolution of the identity. There is no knowledge. There is an absolute oneness at this plane. And these words that we are using, they are more like symbols. And Sri Aurobindo emphasizes that through these lines. He says that the symbol, the expressive reality, may give an idea, a perception, sense, vision, contact, even of the thing itself to us. But at last, we get beyond it to the thing it symbolizes. Transcend idea, vision, contact, pierce through the ideal, and pass to the real realities, the identical, the supreme, the timeless, and eternal, the infinitely infinite. So the words that we are using, they are more like symbols or ideals or creating visions and imaginations. But then in the Anandmaya Kosha, we pass through all of these into the real realities, from the ideal to the identical, the supreme, the timeless, and the eternal, and the infinitely infinite. And when that happens, or when something similar happens, because again, if there is an absolute Anandmaya Kosha, there is something similar of that at every plane as well. And when we experience this absolute oneness, where there is no relative thing, one may refer to it as a nirvikalp samadhi. In meditation, there is a savikalp samadhi and a nirvikalp. Savikalp is when one goes into that silence and yet one is aware of the mind and still aware of its thoughts. And then there is a nirvikalp samadhi where there is this absolute nothingness. So when one experiences this, then one of the natural tendency that emerges, because there is Ananda there, is not wanting to come back here into the world of strife. And one seeks, I want to now attain nirvana and go beyond this life of birth and death, and let me live there. And that is what nirvana means. But the truth is that this is also an illusion of nirvana. It is not the true nirvana. Because true nirvana, because this also is a kind of a desire in the mind that I go beyond the birth and death cycle. So the true nirvana goes beyond all the lures set up for us. And this is where Sri Aurobindo shares how the divine attracts a soul towards itself through three different lures, which seem like the ultimate Ananda. The first lure is an outward lure of earthly rewards. That let me have that success, or let me have that money, or food, or the best possible joys, intellectual prowess, science, art, all these things, or morals and ethics. I want to be the most morally correct person, ethically correct person. All of these are the first level of lures where the person is fully invested in trying to experience Ananda through these outward lures. the person who goes beyond this lure into the second level of lure, they start seeking the bliss inside, or a heavenly bliss. The first level of that is a bliss के मरने के बाद स्वर्ग मिलेगा. But then it gets more and more subtle, more and more purified, to seeking an unconditional bliss, to ultimate level of purification where one seeks the union with the Supreme Divine. One doesn't want anything else, one just wants to be with the Divine. So one can see the two polarities, and then there is a third lure, we'll come to it, but one can see the polarity between these two lures. At the first level, the mind is turned outward and downward. In this world, downward and outward. One is seeking Ananda through different things and objects, and satisfying oneself through various different, it could be a very physical need of food, water, sex, or it could be a very vital need of ambition and success and power, or it could be a more of a mental and aesthetic need, intellectual need of being a scientist or a very knowledgeable person or an artist. But all the same, this side of the polarity is outward and downward. And on the other end, there is another force which pulls a person towards the second lure, which is the bliss. And that light bulb of unconditional joy inside, which is inward and upward. And there is a push and pull between the two. And first the person learns to transcend the first lure by what Srimad Bhagavad Gita talks about, being with everything but not being attached. So losing any inward attachments to things, renouncing the inward attachments, surrendering the desire for the fruit. When that happens, then one can transcend the first lure. And one can transcend the second lure, because in the second lure also, just like in the first lure, one can seek the divine. भगवान को pray कर रहे हैं, वो भी एक outside है कि हमें ये चीज़ मिल जाए, मेरी ये job लग जाए, या फिर संकट मोचन है, मेरे को इस संकट से बाहर निकाले भगवान. So in the context of spirituality also, one can be attracted towards the divine कि मेरा ये बाहर वाला काम हो जाए. Or even in the inner journey, one can be attracted and seeking this bliss, because when you come down with this, one experiences this bit of the light and power of the divine, and one comes down, there is a little more power, there is a little more intuition, there is a little bit of knowledge which brings a certain success. So even this seeking of inner bliss can get in a subtle way muddled with the outer lures. One can seek the divine bliss for the outer success, but eventually one can transcend it if one's seeking becomes purely if one wants to experience the presence of the divine or a union with the Supreme Absolute Divine. When that becomes the ultimate seeking, then one transcends the second lure, arriving at the third lure, where now there is an experience of the Absolute Divine, there is Ananda, and one says that it has been hard work transcending these two lures, purifying myself from so many different levels of illusion. Now I don't want to go back to these illusions again. God, please take me away from this cycle of birth and death. I want to live there. And this is where the third lure needs to be transcended, and understand that one needs to avoid this egoistic seeking and actually offer oneself entirely to this Absolute Divine. Offer one's will, offer one's heart, offer one's love, offer one's energy, offer one's senses, mind, thought, gifts, knowledge, skills, everything to this Absolute Divine. And then one can truly see that Absolute Divine in everything, everywhere. Then the experience of unity and oneness and infinitism becomes the primary experience, and the multiplicity of life is born out of this oneness. And within every multiplicity, within every little grain or every little animal, plant and human being, one sees that same unity at its depth, that supreme divine at its depth. And then it becomes immaterial to seek the nirvana, the illusional nirvana, liberation of one's own self only for coming out of suffering. And then the ultimate aim is to do whatever is the divine work and offer oneself to the divine. So that is the way to transcend this third lure, again built around the sense of Ananda for a person. And that is when one moves closer or aligns oneself to the Anandamaya Kosha. When one offers oneself fully, that unconditional love and Ananda can flow and be reflected from that higher plane. One may not reach that plane, but one can align oneself to the true Anandamaya Kosha, and the light and joy from that plane can be reflected. And Sri Aurobindo describes this plane through these words, that the bliss soul is not bound to birth or to non-birth. It is not driven by the desire of the knowledge or harassed by the fear of the ignorance. कि मैं वापस यहाँ पे आऊँगा, वापस ignorance होगा. It is not harassed by that fear of ignorance. The supreme bliss soul has already the knowledge and transcends all the need of knowledge. So the Ananda plane has all the knowledge, yet it transcends the need of knowledge. Not limited in consciousness by form and the act, it can play with the manifestation without being imbued with ignorance. So at this plane, there is a dissolution of the center of regulation. There is a dissolution of even knowledge and the knower and the known. So it in a way embodies what we say ignorance is bliss. So Ananda plane is another level of ignorance is bliss, because at this level there is another kind of ignorance which goes beyond the knowledge. And when this Ananda comes into the plane of ignorance, it doesn't drown in the ignorance. It floats on top of the ignorance. And it can engage in the world play from the space of this Ananda. And it embodies the words for us that ignorance is bliss. So that brings us to the culmination of this chapter. And just to summarize that our journey started in this chapter first from understanding that Ananda pans out at every plane of consciousness, and one needs to ward off that thinking that this is the ultimate experience of Ananda. One seeks integral perfection. The second thing is that in process of experiencing freedom and Ananda, one doesn't have to let go of one's current center of regulation and turn into a Jadavat or an Unmat Tadavat, into a leaf, floating leaf, or a divine madness. One has to channelize the impulse to freedom towards the divine control. And then one has to become aware of the three lures through which a seemingly Ananda, the divine attracts us through Ananda, but how these three lures need to be transcended in order to align with the true Anandamaya Kosha. And ultimately, a basic understanding of what really is Anandamaya Kosha, how it goes beyond the Vijnanamaya Kosha and is the plane of ignorance is bliss.